I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine, analyse Russia's sham presidential elections, and delve deeper into French President Emmanuel Macron's growing support for Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 18th of March, 2 years and 23 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Foreign Correspondent James Kilner, Paris Correspondent Henry Samuel, and from Washington DC, Deputy US Editor Rozina Sabur. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
So it's been a continuation over the weekend of this recent campaign by Ukraine of going after Russia's energy infrastructure. More on that in a moment. But overnight, Sunday, Monday, more Russian airstrikes have left dead and wounded civilians across Ukraine. Vitaly Kim, the regional governor of Mykolaiv, the city down south, said a double missile attack on the city had left casualties and damaged the city's lighting and transport infrastructure. Then in Sumy region, the settlement of Velika Pisarivka, that's about 60 k's northwest of Kharkiv. It's literally right on the border, about 5 k's only from the border with Russia. That was hit over the weekend more than 340 times, the local military administration there said. Further south in Nicholls on the Dnipro River, directly opposite the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, a series of Russian drone strikes hit infrastructure there, including a gas station. In all, Ukraine says it destroyed 17 of 22 Shahed drones that Russia launched last night. That comes from the Air Force. Next point. As I say, continuing the recent theme, over the weekend, Ukraine launched a massive wave of drone strikes against Russia, particularly on Saturday night. In Ukraine, they forced the Kerch Bridge to close. They grounded flights from all 3 airports around Moscow. Russian authorities said that the Kerch Bridge had been closed for about half an hour on Sunday morning, although they didn't explain why. Fair enough. In Moscow, the Domodedovo, Vnukovo and Sukhovsky airports had to put flight restrictions on for about 3 hours after 4 drones were shot down near Moscow. That comes from Russia's state aviation watchdog. And then Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, said a 5th drone close to Domodedovo airport was also shot down, or later, after that first wave, with no casualties or damage reported. Although there is footage, you'll see images circulating on social media that appear to show a hole in the roof of one of the buildings at the airport. So something landed on it and made a hole. Elsewhere, a very large fireball erupted at an oil refinery in Savlyansk on Kuban. That's in Krasnodar Krai, so about 75 k's due east of the Kerch Bridge in Russia. That was Ukraine's 6th drone strike on Russian oil facilities last week. In total, Russia's defense ministry said it downed 17 drones attacking the Krasnodar region, but local Russian military intelligence said on Telegram that a fireball broke out as a result of the fall of one of the devices. Ukrainian military intelligence is said to have been behind these strikes. That was a security source speaking to Ukrainska Pravda. Now then, just to keep up on all of this, that means 12 Russian oil refineries have been successfully hit in the last couple of weeks, this sort of phase of Ukraine's campaign, if you like. So we're up to 12 of the current phase. The targeted facilities account for about 12% of Russia's oil-producing capacity, according to Bloomberg. They came out with that stat last week. So 12%, it's not nothing, but it's not a huge amount. This will be for this campaign to be very successful, a lot more needs to be done. However, they show no signs of stopping. Now, another 2 drones were shot down over the Kaluga region. That's just south of Moscow, and also the Yaroslav region. That's northeast of Moscow, according to Russia's defense ministry. And they say more Ukrainian drones are also shot down in the areas bordering Ukraine, Belgorod, Kursk and Rostov regions. Vyacheslav Gladkov, the governor of Belgorod, reported damage to electricity and gas supplies in the area. Then TASS, the Russian state-owned agency, said a fire had broken out at a polling station in Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine after it was hit by a Ukrainian drone. However, I've been looking around, can't find any imagery or any other evidence for an alleged drone strike on a polling station. President Zelensky did not address any of the reported attacks in his nightly video calls, on Saturday. He did, however, thank his military forces and intelligence for the new Ukrainian long-range capabilities. I think that's probably another dig at Germany there. He said the Russian war machine has vulnerabilities that we can reach with our weapons. Right, next one. Russia has apparently ordered the installation of large-caliber machine guns on its Black Sea warships to counter the threat from drones. Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, you'll remember, he was visiting what's left of the Black Sea fleet in southern Russia. He said there must be training for personnel every day, training on how to repel attacks from the air and by uncrewed boats. The Defence Ministry statement said Shoigu had ordered the installation of additional firepower, large-caliber machine gun systems to defeat enemy drones. You'll remember the Kremlin last week sacked its top naval commander of the military after a series of humiliating setbacks for the Black Sea Fleet. They replaced Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, the Russian Navy's commander-in-chief, in post since 2019, with Admiral Alexander Moiseev. Now, a bit of an old one here, so let's go now down to Moldova. Pro-Russian separatists in Transnistria have blamed Ukraine for an explosion at a military base there. So this is the area of southeast Moldova that pro-Russian authorities, they don't have much authority, but pro-Russian officials, if you like, so-called officials, are claiming. So this strike was about 75 k's northwest of Odessa. A Russian military unit there reportedly came under attack from a Ukrainian kamikaze drone. Local self-proclaimed officials said, I think that's probably the best way to describe them. Messaging on social media, they said, today a fire occurred on the territory of a military base in Tiraspol as a result of an explosion. It was preliminarily established that the explosion was caused by a kamikaze drone attack. They said the drone came from the Odessa region. Moldova disputed the claims and said the incident in question is an attempt to provoke fear and panic in the region. You'll have a look find it online. There is very underlined, very dodgy footage of the alleged incident on social media. You see an Mi-8, a HIP helicopter, supposedly hit by a drone, although if you look closely, the drone sort of wobbles around in the air for a bit and then disappears. Almost as if whoever was trying to learn Photoshop that day went and had lunch. And then there's a big explosion next to the HIP, which looks like something's been set off underneath it. I don't know, got no more evidence than what I can see with my eyes, but it looks extremely amateur hour for me. So I don't think that happened. But as you remember, Transnistria borders Ukraine's Odessa Oblast, is internationally recognised as part of Moldova, but Russian troops have been there since the early 1990s, when Russia invaded the region under the pretext of protecting ethnic Russians, where we heard that one before. Russia's foreign ministry said Moscow would, quote, consider with attention the appeal by pro-Russian so-called authorities in Transnistria for protection. They made that call a couple of weeks ago. Moldova signed a bilateral defence deal with France earlier this month when President Macron met his Moldovan counterpart Maya Sandu in Paris. After the meeting, Monsieur Macron pledged unwavering support to Moldova in the face of the Russian threat. They do seem to be ramping up the rhetoric around Transnistria, although, quite frankly, they can't really do anything about it. They can't get through Odessa and they can't launch an amphibious assault. So, it's just words at the moment. And then a couple more for me. David Zelensky has blamed Ukraine's lack of long-range strikes on what he calls the short-sightedness of allies. Another apparent snub to Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor. On, I think it was Sunday, his evening address, President Zelensky thanked Canada for joining a drone coalition and then added, the short range of our army's capabilities is an obvious short-sightedness of some partners. Later in his speech, he thanked Germany for its weekly steps to support our country and people. So the pressure's still on about Taurus. Germany has been, after the United States, the second biggest provider of aid, military money and humanitarian support to Ukraine. Let's not forget that. But, Taurus. And then finally, sticking with Germany, one of Olaf Scholz's top allies in the German parliament has urged him to ask how to freeze the Ukraine war. This is seen as a possible sign of a party split over how to stand up to Russia. So speaking during a debate on sending weapons to Ukraine, Rolf Mutzenich, who's the head of Mr. Scholz's Social Democrat Parliamentary Party, asked, instead of asking how to wage war, isn't it time to ask how we can freeze a war and end it later? I'll just let the outrage die down a bit. His comments were immediately condemned by the SPD's coalition partners, with Ricardo Lang, the Green Party head, describing the comments as the old Russia policy and saying that it would clearly lead to incredible suffering for the many people in the occupied territories. Andrei Melnik, who's a former Ukrainian ambassador to Berlin, described Mr. Mutzenich as the most nauseating German politician. I presume he means just in recent years. History would not stand that comment up. So it's all kicking off in the Bundestag, David, and I'll take a pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Let's try that out and go next to foreign correspondent James Kilner. James, you've been watching the Russian election unfold over the weekend. Could you give us your take on it? What happened and what's your analysis?
We wanted to talk about the Russian election quickly. So the salient points about this election are really that, the obvious is that Putin's got another 6 years in power officially. This will, by the time he sees out this 6-year term up to 2030, and he will, by that point, have overtaken Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, as the Kremlin's longest-serving leader of this century. So that's something of a milestone. The other big milestone that we saw last night was confirmed this morning by Elena Yello-Kanfalova, head of the Russian Central Election Committee, is that Putin officially won this vote with 87.3% on a turnout of 77.5%, which is a massive, massive number. We need to talk about this briefly. This is a sort of number to expectations. I think people would be told in the run-up to this election, the Kremlin really wanted to use this opportunity to showcase ordinary Russian support for Putin and his war in Ukraine, and that they'd been told to really ramp up the numbers, and they used various techniques, which are written about at some length in the newspaper, to achieve this. But we were expecting a number of around 75-80% victory for Putin on a turnout of about 65-70%. So even by the Kremlin's own standards, this has been, the Kremlin's sort of vote manipulation machine has outdone itself and has really recorded what is getting up to the level of sort of Central Asian autocrat level, where they typically like to be in the 90s. Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, scored a 92% victory in a presidential election last month, so Putin's getting up there. That in itself is very interesting. The other point is, again, as I've written about some length over the last few days, is the level of protests that we saw around Russia at the polling stations, which are open for 3 days. So this came in really two forms. There were several individual sabotage attempts at ballot boxes and polling booths. This mainly to the form of pouring bright green ink into the polling booths to spoil all the ballots, and several arson attacks. We're talking about maybe 24, maybe a bit more than that, around Russia. Unprecedented, really. I've never seen this sort of thing before. And then on Sunday, yesterday, we also had the opposition in exile called for Nude Against Putin protests, which was a sort of a silent flash mob across the country targeting polling stations. As your listeners know, David, protests are banned in Russia, completely banned almost. Any anti-Kremlin demonstration gets pounced on and a participant immediately arrested. So what the opposition did is they said, right, how are we going to work this out? How are we going to try and undermine this election parade in Russia? And how are we going to show the world that people actually still do oppose the Putin regime? And they came up with a rather genius and daring strategy of asking anti-Kremlin dissenters to throng their polling stations at midday on Sunday in a sort of silent flash mob. Very difficult for police and the authorities to do much about that. After all, they're just turning up at the polling stations as the Kremlin's propaganda machine has told them to do for the last few months. And by all accounts, people I spoke to, the photographs I saw, the videos I watched, etc., there was a remarkable number of Russians who braved threats from the Kremlin in the run-up. The Kremlin had specifically said that people would go to prison for several years if they turned up in this flash mob, and they still turned up to essentially visually protest against Putin in the Kremlin. They then went into ballot boxes and spoiled their ballots and photographed them with various anti-war, pro-Navalny, anti-Kremlin slogans. So really interesting things going on in Russia over the weekend with this election.
James, can I ask you just first of all, I mean, there's so many good questions I think to ask you here. As you said, we know that these numbers are manipulated and changed by the regime, and we can get onto that, I think. But how useful are these numbers to gauge the level of support for Putin in society? Can we say anything from looking at this, or are they completely useless?
I think, David, that we can really work out very, very little from the hard data. All the sort of signs we've seen is that this was a Kremlin voter manipulation, vote fixing campaign on overdrive. There's a Russian vote monitoring NGO called Knowles, which has come out and said that this is one of the most fixed elections in post-Soviet Russia. You know, it's all out there. They opened the polls for 3 days. They ordered state workers to vote for Putin. They bribed them with vodka. They threatened them by saying, if you don't vote, you're going to get your wages docked. They used electronic voting for the first time in a Russian election, having trialled it last September in regional elections, and they were able to tweak all the numbers on the electronic voting. And it also comes after Putin really had absolutely no opposition whatsoever. There were 3 other candidates, all of which had previously pledged their allegiance to Putin and said they were pro-war. The 2 anti-war candidates were disqualified very early on. The genuine opposition is in prison. There really is very, very little to gauge from this. Sort of people who are trying to analyse where the Russian population stand on Putin and his war sort of have come up and said maybe a third support the war, a third are indifferent or don't want to know about it, and a third are against it. And so an election victory of 87% for Putin is quite ridiculous. He does retain some strong support, especially in the rural communities, poorer rural areas, and his propaganda machine is enormous and has been bombarding people for 2.5 decades now, and especially intense in the last 2 years since his invasion of Ukraine. So he does have some popularity. He did pledge a huge amount of handouts, maternity benefits, unemployment benefits, and promising to boost schools and universities, etc., and build roads. Before the election, something like $130 billion worth of handouts, which are highly unlikely to come around. So he does have some level of support. You have to remember, though, David, that even in the rural communities, this support may have actually diminished since the war, although obviously his propaganda says the war isn't necessary to defend Russia against Nazis. A lot of the mobilization and conscription for the Russian army, which has been absolutely battered and for the first 2 months of this year, or since December, been losing 900 men a day, has been from these rural communities. So it's really, really difficult to honestly say that Putin is just so popular that he won 87% of the votes.
Another few quick questions from me before I know Dom has a question as well, and then we'll go to Henry Samuel in Paris. But James, first of all, looking at these protests, you've been watching Russia and reporting on Russia for many, many years. Did the level of protests surprise you? Did the technique surprise you at all? I think it's interesting to get your sense of just how impactful this was, just how surprising this was.
That's a really good question, David. I think it has to be put in the current context of this regime which is totally intolerant of any dissent, and we've seen loads and loads and loads of ordinary people get sent to prison for months or even years by coming out and holding little anti-Kremlin or anti-war slogans in public place. So the level of no one knew what was going to happen at midday yesterday. There was all sorts of pontifications and build up to it, but I think the actual level was really important. Just the act of defiance and protest in Russia now is so difficult and so dangerous, and especially being directly threatened by the Kremlin with prison. To see people come out in their thousands and their hundreds, etc., without much coordination. It was just put out by call. Navalny's widow, Yulia, and her staff sort of announced this. They floated the idea they didn't really know what was going to happen, and it was staggering. I really think it was important, and I really think the Kremlin would have been surprised and very irritated by this shared defiance. As for the individual sabotage acts, again, absolutely remarkable. These are quite violent acts, and each one is going to be punishable up to 5 years. And annoyed the Kremlin authorities so much that so this was mainly happening on Friday, the first day of voting, that by Friday afternoon or Saturday morning, they said, right, we're going to increase the punishment for anyone trying to attack a poll booth to 8 years. So they really got under their skin. And I think this context is really important to consider these demonstrations by.
Well, as you said, Putin is now president for another 6 years. Do we have any sense of what changes we should expect, or will it be very much business as usual from the Kremlin?
I think for your listeners, David, who are primarily interested in the war in Ukraine rather than Russian politics per se or Russia's economic policy, I think, and analysts I've been speaking to, now that Putin has cleared this election hurdle, annoyance, Russia elections, like all these elections, they're an opportunity, but they're also very dangerous. So it's an opportunity to use the machine for a huge propaganda tool, etc. But it's also a danger because it gives opponents the opportunity to disrupt the flow. Now that this election's been cleared, the analysts I speak to, and my hunch is that, and with Putin confident about what's happening in Ukraine and on the international scene, I think we're going to see a doubling down, unfortunately, about his greater Russia policy and his war in Ukraine. One analyst is very specific. He said, obviously, that none of those $130 billion social spending will come through because it's all going to be directed to the Kremlin's main aim, which is winning the war in Ukraine. And he actually anticipated directly another round of mobilization in May this year, so in a couple of months' time, to really ramp up the flow of men to the war and take advantage of apparently a lack of soldiers and weapons in Ukraine. So very difficult time ahead, I think.
Well, thank you very much, James. Dom, did you have a quick question to James before we go to Henry Samuel?
Yep, sorry, a very quick question then. Hi, James, great to speak to you again. Just wonder if there's a kind of dictator's dilemma here. You come out with a figure of 87% and we all go, what a load of nonsense. If Russia had said, actually, he won with 64% of the vote, well, would we be able to say, well, that's ridiculous? I mean, it's still a landslide. Would lowering the figure have been deemed internally as fatal for him to try and achieve something that might be slightly more believable? Would that in itself have done for him? Has it ever been done? Have dictators ever reduced their winning margin to something that's not utterly ridiculous, just a little ridiculous?
Yeah, I was trying to make this point earlier when I was drawing an analogy with Central Asian autocrats. When these hard men autocrats, especially the former Soviet type, when they start really ramping up their numbers, they start to move into a completely different realm, flight of fancy. And I think with Putin getting so close to 90%, we have definitely tipped into that. Previous elections, he was in the 60s, might even be in the 50s in one of them, I can't remember. But nothing on this scale whatsoever. And again, turnout is just absolutely massive. I think if he'd gone for something like 65% or whatever, you could stomach that a bit better, I guess. But 87% on a turnout of 77.5 is pretty crazy. And I think this was the Kremlin's voter manipulation machine really pushing the boat out for the benefit of its domestic politics, so that the domestic propaganda machine, which is incredibly important to Putin, can say, look how united we are. We have to win this war. These numbers are all should be viewed through the prism of war in Ukraine. So from that point of view, getting an excessively high number and running that out is probably a priority for the Kremlin.
Well, thank you very much, James Kilner, for your thoughts there. Thank you, Dom, for your question. Henry Samuel, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you back on the podcast. We wanted to bring you on, Henry, because, of course, for several days now, we've been commenting on the apparent Damascene conversion of French President Emmanuel Macron towards Ukraine's cause. He's obviously given a number of interviews last week, made a number of public comments about France's position and how it's changing. Could you set the scene for us? Can you tell us what's going on in France? Why is Macron doing this?
Yes, hello there. Delighted to be back on the programme. Macron's Damascene conversion, it hasn't happened overnight. If you just to give you a little bit of history, obviously you remember that France was very slow, first of all, to even admit that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. In fact, they kept telling us it wasn't going to happen despite all these tanks and troops amassing on the border. So they were really caught short there. And before that happened, Macron was desperately tried to act as a kind of negotiation. He kept phoning Putin, went to see him on that very long table, if you remember. All to nothing. And in fact, at the time, he said, look, we must not humiliate Russia. So he got a lot of stick for that. Then, fair play, he realised that Putin had taken him for a ride and that it wasn't going to work. And last year in Bratislava, he kind of did a mea culpa in front of Eastern European countries in which he said, I got it wrong. We're 100% behind Ukraine. We can't trust Putin. So that was the beginning of the change. And it's gradually gained traction. And I spoke to somebody close to Macron last week and I said, so what is this all about? And they said, really, it comes down to three apparently unrelated factors. The first is most definitely national. And that is we are, as you know, entering the European election campaign. And there are very worrying polls for Macron, which is that the hard-right national rally of Marine Le Pen, which is run, the European campaign is run by a 28-year-old called Jordan Bardella, is way out in front in the polls. In fact, the latest poll puts them on 31%. That's 13 points ahead of Macron's Renaissance Party. So there's a real worry there. And so basically, the national rally and Le Pen have historically been Putin admirers. And Le Pen famously went to see him before the last presidential election. He was even on her a manifesto, which had to hastily be changed after he invaded. So basically, Macron wants to say, look, I'm being very clear about this. We're going to take on Russia. And you can't trust Marine Le Pen's national rally. They are unclear on Ukraine, and they're soft on it, and essentially they're Russia appeasers. So that's the first step. The second factor is what this source told me was a veritable duel between France and Germany, and relations are incredibly bad. They're even worse than you might think, said the source to me. Despite various attempts, it's really Macron, Scholz and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, just cannot see eye to eye. But beneath it all is the fact for the French is that the Germans have cast into question what they call it was an implicit deal in Europe and the world, whereas the Germany took the economic leadership and France took the strategic leadership. And that's how it worked for the last 30 years. And the French are saying, the frontiers are now blurred since the beginning of the Ukraine war and Germany suddenly deciding to pump 100 billion into defense. It wants to take the lead in some way on that front. And in particular, they cite Sky Shield, which you probably know about, which is this European defense program. It involves the US and Israel. And France got very annoyed that Scholz decided to join that rather than create something more European. So that was a big source of annoyance. So that was the second factor. And the third, we can go back to that if you like, but the third factor is essentially Macron wants everything he does now. He's thinking about his own political legacy. This is his second and last term, and he wants to be known as the leader, the European leader who took the lead in taking on Russia and Putin. So those are the three factors. But it's obviously caused a huge amount of strain with Germany, and it's causing strain with, as we know, the UK and the US and most other allies were surprised by the fact that he came out with very strident comments in which he refused to rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine. This is the crux of the latest problem. And in true Macron style, he won't back down on these. Au contraire, only on Saturday, he reiterated this and said, look, I'm not saying that France is taking any initiatives. We don't want any escalation, but I can't rule out that at some point we'll have operations on the ground to counter Russian forces. So he's sticking with that. So those are the kind of main reasons behind it. But if you look at the domestic side of things, it's not working in that the polls are showing that the national rally seems to be getting stronger and stronger. So the fact that he wants to say, look, the Le Pen lot are basically pro-Putin. If you start getting them into the European Parliament, they're essentially working for Russia. That doesn't really seem to be working. And there's a certain amount of worry amongst his own camp that we've got to stop just talking about Ukraine when it comes to European elections. We've got to also explain why it would be bad news to have National Rally come first along with other hard right parties for the whole European project. So there is a bit of worry about that. But another thing, there are polls as well, this is a worry for him, that show that a large majority, around 68% of people actually oppose his line on sending Western troops. And most people are obviously opposed to Russia. But there was an eye-for-thought poll out last week that suggested there's a progressive erosion of support for the Ukrainian cause. It's not working for now, but I think there is a genuine feeling that they need to call out the fact that the National Rally has been incredibly pro-Putin for a long time, and several of its members remain to be so, like Thierry Mariani, who's an MEP who's on the list of the European list and who's been incredibly outspoken in his support. So, it's kind of fair enough, but it doesn't seem to be making a mark on the French public. And then, there is one other thing perhaps I should point out, which is I think that the elite, the French, have been quite shocked, at the harder line that's coming from the Kremlin in recent months. This is genuine. They're worried that obviously the Russian economy is on a permanent war footing. The death of Navalny, and we've just seen these elections. But also, there's been a series of massive cyber attacks on France. First of all, hospitals. There's been a concerted attempt to create fake French news sites, bringing out loads of rubbish. And last week, 43 million accounts of individual French people were hacked from the National Unemployment Agency. And I think there's a suggestion that the Russians may have been behind that. There's an overall feeling that the threat, including the threat to France, is on the rise. In February, Paris revealed that there are a Russian network of 193 sites called Portal Combat, designed, as I said, to flood the French language social networks with false information. A couple of days later, the Elysee was shocked to read a tweet from former Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, which was taken as a death threat, actually, in which Medvedev said Macron seems to have been so afraid of a real or presumed assassination in Kiev that he's cancelled his trip. So basically, there was a fake news that Macron cancelled his trip to Kiev because we know he does want to go to Kiev and Odessa. And, the Russians was making a thinly veiled threat towards them. And I think that was taken as really below the belt. And then later in February, the French defense minister also revealed that a Russian air traffic control system had threatened to shoot down French reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace over the Black Sea. Again, that was considered going even further on the red lines than they'd expected. So all of those factors together explain why Macron has upped the tone. And of course, his aides say, yeah, you can say this is all electioneering, but it's not just that. Macron generally believes he's a transgressive Macron. He likes to kind of lob a grenade, a sort of rhetorical grenade in there, like he did when he said that, NATO was brain dead, in the hope that, it'll get things moving. And what his camp is saying is somebody had to stand up and say, we need what they're calling a sursaut. A sursaut, a sort of wake-up call, really. We need a wake-up call, and we need to kickstart a stronger and more robust defence. And also, as he said in a kind of televised interview late last week, he's linking Ukraine's threat of existence to the existence of Europe and the European Union, suggesting if they lost, it would be the beginning of the end. So, he's turned this into a fight, really.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Just one question from me, then one from Rozina, I believe, as well. You've sort of explained the three main reasons, as you see it. It's domestic politics, European elections that are upcoming, this internal sort of European duel with Germany, and also Macron thinking about his legacy and what he wants to leave behind after he's after he stops being president of France. Can I ask you just quickly, before we go to Rozina, just quickly, what's the reaction been in France? How has it been reported on? And what are ordinary people saying?
You know, there have been some military types who've been supportive, who've said, look, you know, he's right. We can't be ruling this out. This whole notion of strategic ambiguity, as he puts it, it was very important not to create red lines. It was a very defeatist attitude. And I think there are a lot of, you know, analysts who agree on that side. But there is this thing that he might be saying the right thing, but he's just not saying it in the right way. And he's kind of being arrogant. And why can't he be more inclusive? Why does he end up always looking like he's on his own instead of... The whole idea is to have a united front. And obviously they tried to do that when they held a Weimar, you know, triangle press conference with the German Chancellor and the Polish Prime Minister Tusk last Friday. But in France, Macron's popularity is on the wane, and he's obviously a president who cannot run again. And obviously he introduced a pension reform that was extremely unpopular. And the farmers' revolt, they were very angry with him, despite the fact that he has done quite a lot for farmers. But even so, he got it in the neck. And so, yeah, I do think that there is a sense that he's gone a bit too far. And also, there's too much grandstanding going on. There's a sense that maybe this is electioneering because he's worried about the European elections. So there is a bit of skepticism. But it's not all one way. There are some people who say it's good that he's standing up and being a bit, you know, Charles de Gaulle-like. Certainly, Macron he's not a flush bust, but he's losing power and he's losing support slowly as we move halfway through his second mandate. And that's obviously a worry for his camp. And I think they're extremely worried about these upcoming European elections, and they're just hoping that they can basically, what the French say, sauver les meubles, which just means save the furniture, or, you know, not be completely trounced and be reasonably close to the national rally. I think that's probably all they can hope for at this stage.
Well, thank you so much, Henry, for all of that. Rozina, I know you had a question for our Paris correspondent too.
Yeah, really interesting to hear you talk about Macron's positioning, because the view from over here in the US, there is probably no European leader Donald Trump loathes more than Macron. He's a regular bogeyman for the Trump circle. So Trump wins back the presidency in November. How do you see that dynamic playing out?
It's funny, isn't it? Because obviously, if we remember, Macron laid out the red carpet for Trump, invited him to 14th of July military parade, and he tried and failed to put on the Gallic Charm offensive with Trump, and then they had this long handshake where Macron wouldn't let him go, if you remember.
Yeah. I
think the French and Macron just thinks, you know what, Trump, he's just being Trump. French bashing is as old as the hills, you know, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if he was to become president, that their relations would be any worse than other European or Western leaders. That may be wrong. I don't know is the answer. But certainly, Macron's also talked a lot about Trump and said this, and that's one of the reasons why he's saying we can't rule out ground troops. Europe cannot rely on the US to bail us out. And he's suggesting that Germany has got to take the blinkers off and stop thinking that the US, which has always been the case, is going to come and save us. And, you know, that's very much to do with the comments coming from Trump when he said basically he wouldn't come and save a NATO country that hadn't paid sufficiently into NATO. So that's the way I see it. Every time he says something anti-Macron, the French and the Elysee just say, well, he's just being Trump. But we'll have to see if he does win, whether he really does go for Macron or not. Of course, that remains to be seen.
Well, thank you very much, Henry Samuel, for joining us today. That was really fascinating. And French listeners, please do let us know what you make and what you'd like to add to that. It's been really interesting hearing you and reading your emails over the past few days. So thank you so much, Henry, for your time. Do stay around to contribute to our final thoughts. Rozina, Sabur, can I come to you last then? Listening to all of these updates from Russia to Paris and obviously to Ukraine as well, what's new in the United States? What shall our listeners know about things like the progression of the non-progression of the aid bill through Capitol Hill? Where are we in Washington, D.C.?
We had Joe Biden's State of the Union in the last fortnight. president really took advantage of the political theatre of that moment to hammer Republicans on Ukraine. It does seem to have had some impact. We heard from Mike Johnson, who is the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, late last week. He finally said, after months of stalling, that he expects to pass a bill with additional military assistance to Ukraine. Now, it's very unclear whether this is the $60 billion in new aid or a much different figure. We just don't know that yet. But this is a shift. We're hearing that Johnson wants to put this to a vote. So the Speaker signalled that he plans to leverage votes from the Democrats to do that, which is an acknowledgement that he doesn't actually have the votes within his own party, and be, politically fraught for Johnson. So not clear at this stage whether he'd pair an aid bill for Ukraine with one for Israel or put it up alone. The former option might boost its chances among Republicans who want to see the country having the defence spending and security needs that it requires with its ongoing war with Hamas. But we're expecting Democrats to continue that pressure campaign on Ukraine aid this week. Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, and other senior Democrats in the House of Representatives are going to continue to hammer Johnson on why there has been no bill put forward yet on Ukraine aid. At the same time, there's a group of Democrats in the House of Representatives who have a focus on national security. They're also strategizing on their own potential ways to force a Ukraine vote this week. There is a bit of a time pressure here because the House will be on a 2-week recess over Easter. But ultimately, Democrats are fairly limited in what they can do. This is a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. And they control the speakership and lead the key committees which determine what legislation comes to the floor and when.
And just finally, Rozina, before we go to our final thoughts, James explained earlier the Russian elections with, of course, inverted quote marks. What's the reaction in the United States to the fact that we'll have a probable another 6 years of Vladimir Putin as Russia's president?
Well, as James explained in depth, this wasn't a surprise result. The US knew this was coming, so we've had a fairly muted response from Washington so far. We did have a statement from a spokesman for the White House National Security Council who said elections were obviously not free, nor given how Putin imprisoned political opponents and prevented others from running against him. Not very much more in terms of what we're hearing from Capitol Hill and the White House at the moment. But, this wasn't anticipated outcomes. This isn't something that the US is newly preparing for. This has been something they've, known was coming and have acted accordingly for a long time.
Well, thank you so much, James, Henry and Rozina, for calling in to give us a bit of a diplomatic tour de table today. Let's go then to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. So tomorrow will be the next meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, the Ramstein process, so-called because it started off at the US Air Base in Ramstein, Germany. That's where tomorrow's meeting is going to be held. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin is going to chair that, as he has the whole process, really. But there was a joint communique put out by Lloyd Austin and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg over the weekend, where they made a couple of points. They said that the group, the Ramstein group, remains what they call the premier venue to coordinate Ukraine security assistance. And they also say NATO is the single authority to set interoperability standards for defence production. Now, okay, fair enough. Have a look at Andrew Gray's Twitter feed. He's the European Affairs editor at Reuters. He said that these were thinly veiled attacks on France and the EU. So when he points out that when Lloyd Austin and Jens Stoltenberg, that Ramstein is the premier venue to coordinate Ukraine assistance, it's like, yeah, not anything set up recently by France, despite Mr. Macron's comments recently. And when they talk about the interoperability standards, and NATO's this kind of daddy when it comes to setting those standards, again, Andrew's pointing out that what they're saying, Jens Stoltenberg and Lloyd Austin, is, it ain't the EU. But as Andrew says, the fact that Lloyd Austin and Jens Stoltenberg chose to spell out these things publicly is rather telling, and he says it suggests that they felt a need to lay down some markers ahead of Ramstein tomorrow. So perhaps tomorrow there might be a little bit of heat going around the room, maybe not quite the warm, cordial meeting that some of them have been, but one to watch out for. Interesting in the context of what Henry was saying earlier on and Mr. Macron's positioning. But thought I'd mention that, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Henry Samuel in France, would you like to share your final thoughts?
I think there's one thing I omitted to say, which is, of course, Macron and France have been accused by Germany, amongst others, of it's all very well to grandstand, but then are they pulling their weight militarily, and are they providing enough material? And it's true, when you look at Germany compared to France, that there's a big gap. The French are putting 3 billion on the table this year, and the Germans 7, and the Germans in all have given 17 billion. So that's one thing. And obviously the French are saying, but hang on, we're providing them with the best kit we've got. We've got Caesar howitzers, we're giving them these medium-range Scalp missiles. And the Germans, why can't they give them Taurus? There's not a big difference between our Scalp and your Taurus. So that's one thing I forgot to say. So I suppose the conclusion is, Macron, he can talk a good talk. There's a logic that sometimes is difficult to argue with. And somebody put this to me the other day. He can convince, but can he persuade? That's the question. Can he get other people around his vision, or is he just going to end up rather lonely figure? That remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Dom and Henry. Rozina, Sabur, would you like the very final words?
Thank you, David. I just think one thing that's worth focusing on is what the last few weeks have revealed is the White House's strategy on funding Ukraine. They are keeping the focus on Republicans in Congress to pass a funding package rather than putting any alternative options on the table. But in private, Joe Biden's team know that, Washington's political dysfunction may prevail, either because Congress doesn't pass an aid package or by passing it too late to actually make the substantive difference that they want for Kyiv. So will they need to reverse course in the coming weeks and months? That remains to be seen.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.